High above the clouds of Europe, the roar of engines echoed like thunder. 800 B-17 flying fortresses glistened in the sunlight, massive, defiant, unstoppable. Below them, the once feared Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, but something was different this time. The myth of Nazi air superiority was about to be shattered, not by luck, but by the unyielding courage of American airmen and the machine they trusted with their lives. It was 1942. Europe lay under the iron grip of Nazi Germany. From the coast of France to the fields of Poland, German aircraft dominated the skies. The Luftwaffe, once hailed as the most advanced air force on Earth, had swept across the continent with unmatched precision, crushing resistance in Poland, France, and even over the English Channel. To many, the skies belonged to Hitler. The world had watched the Battle of Britain, where German bombers pounded London, and though the RAF fought back heroically, the message was clear. German aircraft and pilots were elite, their technology years ahead. So when America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, few in Europe believed that any force could truly challenge Germany's aerial dominance. Across the Atlantic, however, a new kind of war machine was taking shape, a bomber unlike anything the world had seen before. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was a symbol. 4 powerful engines, a range that could reach deep into enemy territory. 13 50 caliber machine guns for defense. And most importantly, a reputation for bringing its crews home, even when riddled with holes. The press called it the Flying Fortress. To the men who flew it, it was both a weapon and a lifeline. One airman would later recall, "We trusted her like a brother. You could fly home with one engine dead, half a wing missing, and she'd still find her way back." The U.S. Army Air Forces believed the B-17 could do something no other bomber had done before: win the air war through daylight precision bombing. The American plan was radical. While the British bombed at night to avoid German fighters, the U.S. insisted on daylight raids, striking enemy factories, rail lines, and oil plants with precision. The idea was simple but risky. Destroy Germany's ability to make war by hitting its industrial heart in broad daylight. Commanders like General Ira Eaker and General Karl Spaatz believed that tightly packed formations of B-17s could protect each other with their guns, creating a wall of defensive fire so dense that no German fighter could penetrate it. It was a daring theory, one that would soon be tested in the most brutal skies on Earth. The first major missions began in 1942, when B-17s of the 8th Air Force took off from bases in England and crossed the Channel. Their targets: rail yards in Rouen, shipyards in Bremen, and aircraft factories in Regensburg. From the moment they entered German-controlled airspace, the crews faced a nightmare. Waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s tore into the formations, their cannons shredding through aluminum skin. Flak bursts filled the sky like black flowers of death. Pilots could see other bombers exploding mid-air, crews bailing out, parachutes burning. Yet somehow, through the chaos, the formations held. A mission report from the 91st Bomb Group read simply, "Enemy opposition heavy. Flak intense, losses severe, but objectives destroyed." The Luftwaffe was stunned. These bombers weren't turning back. They weren't breaking formation. They were punching through the heart of German defenses and returning to tell the tale. But the price was terrible. In those early months, entire crews were lost before reaching their targets. Of the first 300 missions, more than a quarter of the crews never came home. Still, the B-17 proved something extraordinary. It could take punishment no other bomber could survive. There were stories of fortresses limping back to England with half the tail shot off, 2 engines dead, wings shredded with holes, and pilots killed, their co-pilots landing the plane through sheer will. One surviving gunner later said, "Every time we took off, we knew we might not come back. But as long as the fortress could fly, we'd keep going back in." This unbreakable spirit, combined with the machine's resilience, began to change the tide. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's myth of invincibility was being tested. By late 1943, the scale of the air war had transformed. Hundreds of B-17s now filled the skies over Europe, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and later the long-range P-51 Mustangs. Germany was forced to divert vast resources to defend its cities and factories, pilots, fuel, and anti-aircraft guns that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Every raid cost lives, but each mission also chipped away at the Luftwaffe's strength. The myth of German air superiority was beginning to crack, but the real test was yet to come. Deep inside Germany lay the industrial beating heart of Hitler's war machine, the factories of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the oil plants of Mersburg, the ball-bearing works that kept the entire Nazi war effort alive. The Americans were about to take the fight there, and what happened next would redefine the air war forever. Across the Atlantic, the United States was building not just airplanes, but an entire war machine. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't the product of a single genius. It was the result of relentless innovation, testing, and industrial power. Boeing engineers had begun designing the B-17 in the mid-1930s, aiming for a bomber that could fly higher, faster, and further than anything else in the world. By 1938, the prototype had already exceeded expectations. But building hundreds, soon thousands, of these bombers would test America's factories to their limits. Fortresses rolled out of assembly lines with almost surgical precision. Every rivet, every engine, every gun turret was standardized so that repairs in the field could be done quickly. Even if a plane was hit by flak over enemy territory, mechanics could replace damaged parts within hours, keeping the mission tempo relentless. This was industrial warfare in its purest form, turning production into a weapon, a force multiplier that German planners had never anticipated. While factories roared, young American men trained for the skies. The 8th Air Force, stationed in England, was filled with pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners who had never faced combat. Yet, they were drilled relentlessly in formation flying, precision bombing, and defensive tactics. A bombardier recalled, "We learned to trust each other in the fortress. In tight formation, each plane became a gun platform. Alone, we were vulnerable. Together, we were nearly invincible." Squadrons practiced flying in formations of 12 to 24 aircraft, their machine guns overlapping to create a defensive field. The idea was simple. If one plane could defend itself, a formation could defend dozens. By early 1943, German intelligence began observing the arrival of American bombers in England. Initially, they believed the raids would be minor nuisances. Daylight bombing over heavily defended territory was risky, and early losses seemed likely. But as the first mission struck, Luftwaffe planners were shocked. The B-17s were flying higher, faster, and in larger formations than expected. Anti-aircraft defenses and fighter squadrons tried to intercept, but losses were mounting. A German pilot reported, "They are slow, yes, but their guns cover each other. Every time we engage, we find ourselves in a storm of bullets. They press on relentlessly." The first major missions to France and the Low Countries were brutal. The bombers encountered fierce opposition from Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and dense flak fields. Some formations were decimated, yet the surviving planes always returned, bringing invaluable lessons. Formation flying minimized losses. Targeting factories precisely reduced collateral damage and maximized industrial disruption. Each raid, no matter the losses, forced Germany to divert resources to homeland defense. A mission report from the 91st Bomb Group highlighted the paradox. Losses are high, yet our presence forces them to weaken other fronts. We are the hammer striking deep inside Germany. The Americans quickly realized that the B-17 wasn't just a physical weapon. It was a psychological one. German anti-aircraft crews and fighter pilots became increasingly wary. The sight of hundreds of flying fortresses approaching over the horizon was demoralizing. Crews learned to fire preemptively, often out of fear, and mistakes became more frequent. German newspapers, controlled by propaganda, could not ignore the raids. Civilians and factory workers faced the terrifying realization. The Allies could strike deep into Germany, and no one, not even the Luftwaffe, was invincible. By mid-1943, the U.S. had shifted into full-scale aerial offense. The B-17 fleet grew exponentially, with more than 2,000 planes operational in Europe by the end of the year. Missions grew longer, deeper, and more dangerous. Aircraft factories in Regensburg and Schweinfurt, oil refineries in Ploiești, rail yards, and munitions plants in central Germany. Each raid chipped away at German industrial capacity and, more importantly, challenged the myth of Luftwaffe dominance. The Germans began calling these raids the terror of the fortress, a recognition that the US had built something far more than an airplane. They had built a weapon of persistence. By late 1943, the Americans were ready to take the fight to Germany's industrial heart. The lessons of early raids, the sacrifices of air crews, and the unmatched resilience of the B-17 had set the stage. What came next would test the Luftwaffe in a way it had never imagined, and shatter the myth of Nazi air superiority forever. By early 1944, the American bomber offensive had escalated. No longer were raids limited to the periphery of Europe. The B-17s were now flying deep into Germany, aiming straight for the factories, oil refineries, and rail yards that powered Hitler's war machine. And this was where the Luftwaffe's reputation would be truly tested. The Americans had learned from the early missions. Large formations, strict discipline, and defensive coordination became critical. Yet, every mission carried immense risk. German fighters knew the routes, and anti-aircraft batteries, or flak, were waiting over every industrial hub. One of the most famous targets was Schweinfurt, home to Germany's critical ball-bearing factories, essential components for tanks, aircraft, and machinery. On August 17, 1943, nearly 230 B-17s took off from England for a daylight raid. They knew the risks. German fighters were lying in wait, and flak guns surrounded the city. The plan was to strike quickly and retreat before the Luftwaffe could mount a full response. But the Germans were prepared. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarmed the formation, attacking from every angle. Flak shattered windows, pierced fuselages, and ripped through wings. Entire formations were torn apart mid-air. Yet the B-17s pressed on, despite catastrophic losses. Out of 230 aircraft, 60 were shot down, a devastating blow. But the factories were heavily damaged, disrupting ball-bearing production. A German report noted, "The Americans flew in strength and did not falter, even as our fighters and guns tore through their formations. It was unlike anything we had seen. Daylight bombing had advantages: accuracy, visibility, and the ability to strike key targets precisely. But it came at a steep price. Early missions often resulted in 20–30% losses for a single raid. Airmen faced everything from engine fires to bullets shredding their fuselage. Many crews were killed, captured, or forced to parachute over enemy territory. Yet survivors kept flying." A B-17 gunner later recalled, "You could see the planes around you explode and fall, but there was no turning back. If one of us didn't press on, the mission would fail, and the war would keep raging." The Luftwaffe was confident. German aces believed they could thin the bomber ranks, cripple the formations, and restore their dominance over the skies. But the Americans had a secret advantage: numbers, coordination, and sheer resilience. The genius of the B-17 lay not just in its armor or guns, but in the formation tactics. Flying in tight combat boxes, each bomber could cover another with overlapping fields of fire. For a German pilot diving at a formation, the sky was filled with bullets from multiple angles. A single mistake could be fatal. Even experienced Luftwaffe pilots began to notice a pattern. Every formation pressed on, despite losses. Every damaged bomber, if still airborne, continued toward its target. Every raid forced Germany to divert fighters and defenses, weakening other fronts. The psychological effect was profound. German pilots started reporting, "They are not machines we can destroy easily. Each one seems to multiply as we shoot them down." Just 2 weeks after Schweinfurt, the Regensburg raid tested American strategy further. This mission targeted aircraft factories deep in southern Germany. It was a 600-mile round trip, the longest the U-8 bombers had attempted without fighter escort. Crews flew over heavily defended territory, facing both flak and intercepting fighters. Bombs hit assembly lines, crippling aircraft production. The cost? Around 15% of the bombers were lost. Yet the impact on the Luftwaffe was immense. German defenses were stretched thin, fighter groups were exhausted, fuel and pilot shortages became critical. For the first time, it became clear that American bombers could strike at the heart of Germany and survive in significant numbers. The Germans adapted. New fighter tactics, including head-on attacks and coordinated formations, were developed to counter the B-17. Pilots like Werner Mölders and Günther Rahl led elite squadrons to intercept American formations. But every adaptation was met by American innovation. Fighter escorts, such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, extended the range and protection of the bombers, reducing losses and increasing mission effectiveness. The Luftwaffe realized it was in a war of attrition, against American industry as much as against the men in the bombers. By the end of 1943, German intelligence and commanders began to grasp the full scope. The B-17s were not just bombing machines. They were symbols of relentless persistence. Even when one mission suffered heavy losses, the Americans would fly again, day after day, striking at the industrial lifeblood of the Reich. A Luftwaffe officer remarked, "We destroy some, yet more arrive." It is as if their planes are endless, and their resolve unbreakable. The myth of our air supremacy is fading. This realization set the stage for the most daring and costly missions yet. Missions that would truly test the B-17, the crews, and the Luftwaffe's resolve. The stage was set for the greatest aerial showdown of the war. Deep inside Germany, the factories hummed, the fighters waited, and the flying fortresses were poised to challenge the Luftwaffe legend, forever changing the air war. 1944 dawned with the air war over Europe escalating to unprecedented heights. The Americans were no longer probing German defenses. They were striking the heart of the Reich. But the cost was staggering. Each mission tested the limits of man and machine, and every raid became a crucible for courage. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission had proven daylight bombing was possible, but at heavy losses. German fighters, now better coordinated and well-informed, awaited every raid with lethal precision. Anti-aircraft batteries were primed, flak exploding like deadly fireworks across the sky. The next major challenge was Berlin itself, a city protected by miles of flak, radar-guided fighters, and the Reich's most experienced pilots. Hundreds of B-17s in tight formation took off from bases in England, flying low initially to avoid radar detection, then climbing high into the danger zone. The Luftwaffe was ready. Waves of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s intercepted the bombers over northern Germany. Dogfights erupted. Tracer fire cut through the sky, and the first bombers were engulfed in flames. Yet even as aircraft exploded around them, crews pressed toward their targets. Every B-17 carried 13 50-caliber guns, overlapping fire with neighboring planes. Fighter pilots described it as a sky of bullets, a deadly defensive wall that could not easily be penetrated. The Americans learned quickly. Missions were now supported by long-range escorts, first with P-38 Lightnings and later P-51 Mustangs. These fighters protected the bombers deep inside Germany, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to rethink their tactics. The German aces tried head-on attacks, raking the bomber formations, but the flak and defensive guns, combined with escort fighters, made direct assaults deadly. Losses were still high, but survivability increased, and the psychological edge shifted toward the Americans. One veteran bomber pilot recalled, "We could see our friends burning, falling like shooting stars. But when the Mustangs arrived, we finally felt we had a fighting chance." Every mission exacted a toll on German forces. Experienced fighter pilots were killed, aircraft destroyed, and fuel stocks depleted. Even elite Luftwaffe units began to struggle with pilot shortages. The Americans weren't just bombing factories. They were forcing Germany to bleed in pilots, planes, and morale. By mid-1944, intelligence reports highlighted that Luftwaffe dominance in the skies was slipping, as German defenses could no longer respond to the relentless pace of American raids. The human cost was staggering. B-17 crews flew missions lasting 8 to 12 hours, often over hostile territory. Entire formations were shredded by flak, and pilots, navigators, and gunners had to adapt on the fly. A bombardier taking over for a fallen pilot to keep the plane level. Gunners continuing to fire despite serious injuries. Planes returning with half their fuselage missing and still landing safely. These acts weren't rare. They became part of the legend of the B-17, and they shattered the Luftwaffe's belief that American airmen were easy prey. The culmination of early strategic bombing came during Big Week in February 1944. Over 7 days, hundreds of B-17s struck aircraft factories across Germany, targeting the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf plants. The Luftwaffe committed everything it had: elite pilots, massed fighter groups, and new tactics. But the Americans had learned from every previous mission. Combat formations, fighter escorts, and precision bombing coordination were now fully refined. The Germans lost hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots. American losses, though significant, were sustainable due to the vast production and trained crews. The Luftwaffe's air superiority was permanently challenged, and the myth of invincible German fighters was effectively broken. A German officer admitted privately, "These Americans do not fight like men alone. They fight like machines with the will of iron. Every loss is replaced. Every mission is relentless." By spring 1944, the stage was set for overwhelming raids deep into Germany, including oil refineries, munitions plants, and rail networks. The B-17, once considered vulnerable, had become the spearhead of an unstoppable strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots were exhausted. Factories struggled to replace aircraft. The morale of the German Air Force began to falter, while American crews gained confidence with each successful mission. The myth of Nazi air supremacy had been tested repeatedly, and the cracks were now impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the skies over Europe. The flying fortresses were no longer just bombers. They were instruments of attrition, courage, and industrial power, and the Luftwaffe was about to face its toughest reality yet. By mid-1944, the B-17 flying fortress had proven itself in countless raids, but the true test of its power was yet to come. The Americans were preparing for missions that would penetrate deep into Germany's industrial heart, the cities, factories, and refineries that fueled Hitler's war machine. The Luftwaffe faced a stark reality. The age of air supremacy was ending. The strategic bombing campaign was now full-scale and relentless. Every mission aimed to cripple Germany's ability to wage war, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit its remaining strength to defending the homeland. One of the most critical objectives was the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, a lifeline for German tanks, planes, and vehicles. Without fuel, the German war machine would grind to a halt. The Americans launched Operation Tidal Wave in August 1943, a daring low-level raid designed to destroy these refineries. Though costly, more than 50 bombers were lost. The mission proved that the B-17s could strike vital infrastructure deep in enemy territory. Later high-altitude missions, better coordinated with fighter escorts, inflicted lasting damage. German aircraft struggled to defend against the relentless waves of flying fortresses, and fuel shortages began to cripple their operations. The Schweinfurt raids, revisited in late 1943, highlighted both courage and industrial impact. Hundreds of B-17s returned to cripple ball-bearing production, despite losing more than 60 planes in one raid. American commanders analyzed the losses meticulously, adjusting formation tactics and increasing escort coverage. The result? Subsequent raids were more effective, with fewer planes lost and more German factories destroyed. A Luftwaffe pilot later reflected, "We could no longer overwhelm them. Every raid was met with fire from above and below. Their planes were durable, their crews fearless. Our dominance in the sky was slipping." By 1944, American bombing campaigns had achieved a deadly rhythm. The combination of B-17 durability, formation defense, and escort fighters allowed missions deep into the heart of Germany. Munitions factories were destroyed, reducing the production of tanks and aircraft. Oil refineries were repeatedly hit, grounding German vehicles. Rail networks were disrupted, delaying troop movements and supplies. The Luftwaffe could no longer respond effectively. Even elite pilots were exhausted, and replacement aircraft could not arrive fast enough to restore control of the skies. The cumulative effect of these missions shattered the long-held myth of Nazi air superiority. The Luftwaffe could no longer dominate the skies over Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress, despite losses, proved resilient and reliable. American industry and trained crews ensured a steady stream of bombers, overwhelming German defenses through attrition. A German intelligence report admitted the sobering truth. The Americans have learned to fight our skies on their terms. We can no longer claim dominance. Our losses and resources are finite, theirs seemingly endless. Throughout the campaign, countless acts of bravery defined the legend of the Flying Fortress. Pilots flew crippled aircraft back to England. Gunners defended formations even when wounded. Navigators and bombardiers ensured targets were hit despite flak and fighter attacks. One gunner recalled a mission over Bremen. Our plane was on fire, the co-pilot was down, yet we stayed in formation. Every man did his duty. That day we weren't just flying a plane, we were delivering justice from above. These personal stories underscored the combination of technology, tactics, and courage that made the B-17 a decisive instrument in the war. By mid-1944, it was clear. The American air campaign had transformed the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe's once feared pilots could no longer claim superiority. Even the most advanced German aircraft and tactics could not stop the relentless tide of bombers. The Flying Fortress had become more than a bomber. It was a symbol of persistence, industrial power, and unbreakable spirit. The myth of Nazi air dominance, carefully built over years of victories, had been irrevocably shattered. The skies belonged to those who could endure, adapt, and strike with precision. And the B-17 Flying Fortress, with its crews of ordinary men performing extraordinary feats, ensured that the Luftwaffe's reign of terror would never again go unchallenged. With German defenses weakened and production strained, the Allies prepared for D-Day and the final push into Germany. The B-17s would continue to strike deep, supporting ground forces and ensuring the Luftwaffe could never recover its former dominance. The stage was set for the final acts of the air war, where persistence, courage, and industrial might had triumphed over fear, technology, and doctrine. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Elite pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced, aircraft production was strained, and fuel shortages grounded squadrons. The B-17 Flying Fortress had done more than destroy factories. It had shattered the myth of Nazi air supremacy. The success of the American bombing campaign demonstrated a revolutionary principle. Industrial power, combined with strategy and courage, could decisively shape the battlefield. The Luftwaffe could no longer dictate the terms of the war in the sky. Germany had underestimated the resilience, determination, and sheer numbers of American bombers. The myth of invincible German air dominance had been thoroughly broken. Here's the twist. Despite the intense flak, fighter attacks, and catastrophic losses, over 75% of B-17s returned safely from even the most dangerous missions. This was not a miracle. It was engineering, discipline, and teamwork in action. Redundant systems kept engines and hydraulics running even after severe damage. Formation flying provided overlapping defensive fire. Well-trained crews executed split-second maneuvers under fire. The B-17 had become a machine of persistence, capable of surviving what should have been fatal encounters. This resilience forced Germany to rethink the concept of air superiority, proving that determination and preparation could rival technology. The Flying Fortress left an indelible mark on World War II and aviation history, shattered Nazi air dominance, paving the way for Allied ground offensives, demonstrated the power of strategic bombing, altering how wars were fought, inspired generations of airmen, showing that courage, teamwork, and industrial might could defy overwhelming odds. American airmen returning home spoke of machines that seemed indestructible, and crews that refused to yield, forever shaping the legend of the B-17. The myth of German air supremacy had been built on years of victories, skill, and technology. But the B-17 Flying Fortress and the men who flew her showed that even the most formidable force could be challenged and overcome with courage, innovation, and relentless determination. In the skies over Europe, the fortress became a symbol not just of war, but of hope, endurance, and the power of human ingenuity. If you have been amazed by the stories of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the airmen who risked everything to challenge Nazi air supremacy, there are countless more tales waiting in the shadows of World War II. Hit that subscribe button and join us at WWII Valor Echoes, where we bring history to life, one incredible story at a time. The skies of Europe were changed forever. And the stories? They're only just beginning.